Great. Really good to see you. I know I look like I'm about to do a sort of aerobic session and get you all doing star jumps and things. Apparently, this is designed to so that the video can actually pick up sound. So if it looks really weird, just try and ignore that. It probably fits with the rest of my face. So let's try and get into this topic of how do I find my true self. A little bit of my background. So I studied history, a student in Oxford last century, and then did various things, but became a church leader. So was a pastor of a church, and that was a massive privilege because you get to spend time with people when the mask has come off, if I can put it like that. So to be honest, it did sometimes involve sitting near somebody on their deathbed. At times it was talking to somebody in the midst of bereavement. At other times it was positive. You were discussing things as people were about to get married. But actually those moments where in a sense somebody's true self is revealed, where if you like the masks come off and you see into the heart of what makes somebody tick. And that's essentially going to be my approach as we talk about this topic. I'm well aware that the topic of finding your true self is very linked to identity theme, and I guess identity politics is fairly big in the news at the moment, whether as a result of somebody like Kemi Badenoch, I guess, becoming a Conservative leader, or one or two things that have happened in the States recently. Identity politics is a massive theme with a degree of controversy attached, either in favour or the sort of culture wars against. But if I'm honest, I don't particularly want to spend a long time there. That's because there are those moments where people's true self is revealed, and actually at that moment, identity politics is fairly irrelevant. And my guess is as we think about life as students, there are just those moments, aren't there? Walking into an exam room, or a relationship breakdown, or maybe positive things like, I don't know, getting the first in prelims or getting blades as a crew, where actually you have those big highs and lows. And the question I want to think about is, how do you find a form of identity that is solid in the midst of all the ups and downs of life? So in a sense, to take more of a sort of pastoral approach, if I can put it like that, rather than a political approach. Now, I think there are various ways as human beings we can answer the fundamental "who am I" question. Let me give you some possibilities. So here is a possibility. You could see ourselves as, this is fundamentally frozen. Excellent. It's not that important. You could find yourself as a sort of material self. That would be one option, a material self. I guess there are various ways of thinking about our lives as human beings. And one would be simply to regard ourselves as atoms, molecules, to have a sort of reductionistic view of what it is to be a human being. I remember chatting to a friend of mine, and to be honest, I quite admired his consistency on this. He was a strong atheist, definitely didn't believe in God, and did see everything essentially in material things. So remember when he found a girlfriend who actually would later become his wife, and he described the relationship in these terms: probably it is the case that I'm doing this because I want my genes to survive and to last. And that was essentially, and I kind of admired the consistency of that, if I'm honest. But even he would acknowledge it didn't feel particularly satisfying. A kind of sense of, can you really reduce a romantic relationship down to, this might be the best way for my genes to survive? Probably wasn't the thing he wanted to write in his Valentine's Day card. And my guess is for most of us, simply reducing ourselves down to stuff, atoms, molecules, a kind of material view of self, won't be satisfying. Because actually, if all I am is stuff, it doesn't really matter if I get offended. Actually, it doesn't really matter if I get badly treated. And yet there is something within me that says, no, it does matter. There is me. I count. I matter. I can't just be reduced down to matter. And so material self would be one option, but I want to suggest it's not entirely satisfying. probably the most common view in our culture is not so much the kind of material self, but it might be that we want to think about the sort of discovered self. That's to say, how do I work out my true self? Essentially, I look inside myself, see what's there, and I live that out. In other words, I'm defined by my inbuilt desires. Now, I think that will be the prevailing view within our culture and will be expressed in terms of sexuality, gender, other areas where essentially I see where my attractions are going and I have to live that out. Now, I'd want to argue that is massively powerful. In a sense, because we're talking about desires, there is a huge amount of emotional energy that's attached to that. I am my deepest desires, I think will be the prevailing view within our culture. And that will represent quite a shift, actually, across the last 50 years or so to a discovered identity, an innermost identity being the key to finding our true self. Now, that will be strongly felt. I suppose I just want to ask one or two questions about it, really. Essentially, as we've seen that develop over the last sort of 50 years or so in our culture, I think my basic question would be this: are we fundamentally happier as a result? In other words, living out my deepest desires, is that actually the path to true satisfaction? For a couple of reasons. Firstly, what happens in a sense when my deepest desires end up clashing with somebody else's? Do you actually have a way through that in order to actually make life harmonious? Now, to be honest, I think many of the culture wars actually have that at their root, where in a sense one person's deepest desires clash with another person's deepest sense of who they are, and you end up with battles at a cultural level. But it seems to me that the battles are also individual. So, as I say, I used to spend quite a bit of time when I was a church leader conducting weddings and so on. And there were certain ones which, if I'm honest, made me slightly nervous. And that was actually when people were using the language of, you complete me. You are my everything. Because in a sense, it was an expression of a deep desire. You're the one I need. You're going to complete me. Which actually, if you reflect on it, is actually quite a big burden to place on another human being. Because actually, when you have two people coming together in a relationship, where in a sense you're coming with a sense of, I have these desires for you to satisfy me, and the other person is saying the same, well, that's actually quite a big burden to place on each other. And I'm not entirely sure it works, with the result that relational breakdown and so on can occur. In a sense, the cultural way of putting it is expressive individualism, to say, I am my deepest desires and I will live those out. And I think the question is, does that actually work? Does that ultimately promote happiness and harmony or not? And I just think that's a question it would probably be good for us individually and culturally to reflect on a little bit more. But let me give you another possibility. You see, if one possibility is material self, the second identity is sort of discovered self as we look inside ourselves and see our desires. The third, and this will be quite common in a place like Oxford, will be something like a driven self, where in a sense, as we think about who am I, we'll see ourselves primarily as, I am an academic, I'm a physicist, I'm a historian, whatever. Or in a sense, we'll find within ourselves the desire for success within the athletic, sporting arena, or maybe the musical arena, and so on. And that can be the basis for a huge level of achievement. But I also have a question about it as to whether actually that is a stable identity in order to lead to a place of happiness. Because actually, if you end up thinking, who am I? I'm somebody above all else who wants a first, I guess there are two things that can happen. The first is you don't get it. at which point actually your whole self has crumbled. Or it could be, in a sense, to get into the blue boat, or whatever it is. If that becomes the key to your identity, then failure is absolutely crippling. But actually, there's something worse that can happen than failure. It's actually success, and realizing success isn't all it's cracked up to be. Forgive me, I'm going to use an illustration that dates me because, I'm old. But one of the best moments of my life was watching England win the World Cup. I hasten to add this was rugby. I'm not old enough to have seen England win the Football World Cup. But I remember watching England win the Rugby World Cup in 2003. Some of you who are interested in rugby might have seen the clip with Johnny Wilkinson kicking a drop goal. It's fascinating reading Johnny Wilkinson's autobiography because, they lift the trophy, gets a medal put round him. Half an hour later, he's saying, have I just had the best moment in my life? And is it all downhill from here? Which is just kind of astonishing if you think about it, really. Just in a sense, something that actually is a team they've worked for about 4 years. In some ways, the high point, and within half an hour, he's asking, is it just downhill from here? And you see, in a sense, there is a fundamental instability in having an identity that is basically around what can I achieve? Because either failure or success will reveal the fragility of that. And so what I've given you are 3 possibilities. Who am I? Am I just stuff? Am I my deepest desires? Am I somebody who's driven to achieve? And I kind of have a question actually as to whether any of those ends up being a convincing and stable basis for identity. Let me give you a 4th option, which probably won't surprise you in an OICCU event, which is this. I want to argue for the basis of a divinely given identity. A divinely given identity. That is to say, we don't find our identity supremely by looking inside ourselves. We find our identity as something that is given to us by a creator. Christians insist that as human beings, we're not those who are independent. We're those who've been made. We're those who've been created. And there are essentially 3 main ways in which a Christian identity works its way out. The first is this, that the Bible argues that as human beings, we are made in the image of God. So right back at the beginning of the Bible, you get this. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. In other words, a human being can't work themselves out independently because they're created. And so we only truly make sense of ourselves as we relate to our Creator. But in some sense, the stamp of our Creator is put on us, made in the image of God. And that implies various things. It implies dignity. We're more than just matter. We're those who have the very imprint of God on us. And as such, we have worth. As such, we have value. And funnily enough, actually, that becomes the basis for what we feel deeply within us, that human beings have a fundamental equality to us. A few years ago, I was in the States, actually the only time I visited the States in my life, and was going to the museum around the Statue of Liberty. And actually it was stunning. I mean, the Statue of Liberty is stunning. It was a brilliant museum. My only slight nervousness was as I walked around, there was a kind of sense of liberty and equality, how it was discovered in the 18th century. And I remember thinking, hang on, I'm pretty sure equality is basically as old as the first chapter of the Bible. That actually it can go all the way back there. That if you have humanity made in the image of God, then what we sense, the fundamental equality of human beings, their equal value and dignity, is given by God right from the outset. And so humans have that fundamental dignity and worth and value. That thing that we sense about ourselves is God given. There's a second thing, though, that the Christian story wants to say about the Bible, about the human being, is that actually we're also not quite what we should be. So Jesus himself, when he comes to earth, will use the language of human beings at one level being marked by evil and by sin, which is to say there is a fundamental self-centeredness to us. We live in a world made by God, but push him to the margins of life. Now, in a sense, that can be a difficult thing to acknowledge about ourselves. And yet, to be honest, I've become increasingly convinced that it's healthy. Because actually it means you don't need to pretend anymore. I don't actually need to pretend that I'm a better human being than I am. And deep down, I think if we're honest, most of us know that about ourselves. That much as we'd like to claim that we're committed to doing good to other people, there is a fundamental self-centeredness to us that cares massively about our reputations, that cares massively about how we are treated, often, frankly, more than we care about others. And in a sense, it's useful to be able to acknowledge that. There are various reasons that I'm a Christian. I'm fairly convinced by the historical evidence surrounding Jesus. But one of the reasons I'm a Christian is that as I look at the world around me, it matches what Jesus says about human beings. Human beings are astonishing. We're capable of so much good. You know, whether you think of trips to the moon, whether you think of scientific exploration, whether you think of the amazing feats that will happen during Olympic Games, capable of vast amounts, and yet also capable of self-centeredness and hard-heartedness. C.S. Lewis, writer of the Narnia novels, was a fellow over at Magdalen College. In actually one of his Narnia stories, he's got the sort of children who arrive in Narnia. And I love the way this describes what it is to be human. "You come of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve," said Aslan, "and that is both honour enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar, and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. The fundamental dignity of being human, and also the honest realism of what we can be like." And I think that means we have both dignity, and yet we don't need to pretend. And that combination is fundamentally healthy for us. But there's one last thing to say about Jesus' image of what it is to be human. We are created, we're flawed, and yet also loved. The astonishing message of the Christian story is that the Creator God sees us, sees the way in which we live in his world and ignore him, and yet continues to be concerned about us and continues to love us. That's why Christians believe that Jesus came down to earth from heaven, lived a perfect life, died on a cross to pay for our wrongdoing. And he does that because he loves. It's the Apostle Paul, one of the early Christian leaders, who will say this: "The Son of God loved me and gave himself for me." And so what is it to be a Christian? To be a Christian is somebody who knows themselves to be created by God and given dignity, recognizes they are flawed, and yet simultaneously knows themselves to be loved. And I'm convinced that is the true self we can all have. And I'm actually convinced it's the true self that is fundamentally healthy for us and best for us. I remember when I was a student last century and was doing my finals, actually. And sorry if this is triggering for anybody, but I remember going into finals, and you know that sort of experience of you turn over the page and you think, well, I remember that happening in one of my history finals, and yet something suddenly popped into my head, slightly unexpectedly. Nothing that happens in the next 3 hours is going to change who you are. I vividly remember that moment, actually. Nothing that happens in the next 3 hours is going to change who you are. And it's funny, actually, talking to, the sort of debrief after the exam. How was it for you? How was it for you? I remember saying, it was hideous, but hey, there are more important things in life. I remember one of my sort of friends saying, your life is so sorted, isn't it? Now, there are lots of ways, frankly, in which it's not. But I think what she was saying was this: you've got an identity that is stable, that actually doesn't go up and down depending on your relationship status, that doesn't go up and down depending on what you get in finals. Probably that's true. And I'm convinced that's what's best for us, actually, because it means other things can work well. Think of relationships. As I say, as a church leader, I ended up doing quite a lot of weddings. And the sort of things that I loved were when two people got together and they were essentially saying, I'm already secure before I enter this relationship. I already know I have dignity and worth and value and that I'm loved. And so that will enable me to give myself to you. Do you see the difference? If you're driven by internal desires, that's who I am, then you come into this saying, I've got a desire for you and I need you. Whereas actually, if you have a divinely given identity, you say, I'm already secure and I can give myself to you. And I actually think that's fundamentally healthy for us and actually for society. And again, it means those with that secure identity that is stable can go off and do wonderful things in sport and in drama and in music and in academia. Not because that will prove themselves to be worth something. They already know they are. But actually that enables people to go and achieve great things from a stable base. So what I want to encourage us all, actually, as I draw to a close, is this. It's worth reflecting on the who am I question. Maybe we wouldn't call ourselves Christians. And I guess the reality is you can just kind of go through life without asking those fundamental questions. Whereas I think it's healthy for all of us to ask, have I got an identity that is stable and that will enable me to flourish? And I'm convinced the best way to find our true self is to accept we are created with dignity and in Jesus can be loved. And for those of us who are Christians, the reality is we have this identity, but we don't always remember it, actually. So I did tell a story which I came out of quite well. There are plenty of other stories I could tell that where I don't come out quite so well. And that's often because I forget this fundamental identity that I have. And so for those of us in the room who are Christians, can I encourage us as well to press into this identity? Created with dignity, flawed so we don't need to pretend, but deeply loved. And I think that's the way we find our true and best self.